It is a privilege and an honor to join the Disruption as a Form of Innovation Summit on behalf of INROADS with you today. As a proud INROADS alumna, I am just honored to be able to share my thoughts and ideas about what disruption really means at this point in time in our history. 50 years since the founding of INROADS, the implications, the impact that it has had on my life, and the expectation that it created in me as a leader to do more, to be more, and to serve more. Several decades ago, when I think about my introduction to INROADS in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a young Black girl, first generation college student in my family, I had no idea that this many years later, I'd be here with you. Because the narrative around what it meant to be a young Black girl from an underrepresented neighborhood in Milwaukee, well, the odds just weren't that great. But I am so grateful that there was a disruptor among us. And that disruptor was Frank Carr. Frank Carr, who had a vision and an idea that things could be better, that representation could be increased, that he could do more, that even as a disruptor of one, the seismographic effect that he's had on the lives of so many who have had the INROADS experience lives on today. A first generation college student who heard about a mission to develop and place talented, underserved youth in business and industry, and to prepare us for corporate and community leadership. What a radical idea at the time. Back in 1970, when Frank Carr had this disruptive idea, I'm certain that as he thought about the long-term implications of what he was doing, the sacrifices that he made to ensure that we would be here today were yet to be known. And so as we go about the summit, as each of you engage in the various panels and discussion as it relates to disruption, let us engage and think deeply about our part in it. What is the commitment and the sacrifice that we must continue to make? A question that I hear frequently based on where we are today, a global pandemic, political unrest, protest. The question that consistently comes is this a moment or a movement? Is this a moment or a movement? Well, social disruption is a term used in sociology to describe the alteration or the breakdown of social life, often in a community setting. So social disruption implies a transformation in which the old certainties of modern society are falling away and something quite new is emerging. I would submit that we are still in the midst of that transformation, that in spite or despite all of the headwinds of change, of turmoil, of protest, the disruption is necessary, and it begins, it starts, and it continues with us. I submit that this is both a movement and a moment for us to take the time to reflect on what diversity, equity, and inclusion really means. A moment for us to take the time to consider what transformation requires of each of us. A moment for us to be willing to make the necessary sacrifices, to use the intellectual rigor, the kind of energy that is required for us to continue to ensure that inclusion, which is a verb, actually has meaning. When I think of diversity, equity, and inclusion and the power of it to disrupt systems and structures, I look at it this way. Diversity is being invited to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance, but equity means I get to pick the songs to which I dance. The courage that it takes for us as leaders to look at data, information, and the behavioral changes that need to exist in order for us to really activate that disruption that is required. And it is the power of INROADS and all of those who work with us, all of you who are leading organizations, the students who are a part of INROADS today, whose dreams, whose expectations, whose very lives have been so dramatically, and I would say abundantly and wonderfully disrupted by the concept of what you can do. I often said that during my INROADS experience, all of the teachers and educators and leaders and mentors and coaches wrote something on the tablet of my heart. What I learned from INROADS about giving back, lifting as we climb, that's all a part of what has led my career as a leader and my engagement as a civic leader in disrupting patterns that would exclude anyone in our society. And social responsibility. What that means for me is it really is the interconnection of society and business. How do we leverage the resources of organizations, institutions who have a duty to act in the best interests of the environment and society as a whole? Yes, Frank Carr was a disruptor. A disruptor is a way of thinking that produces that unconventional strategy, a way of thinking that turns expectations upside down and takes an industry or an organization into its next generation. 50 years ago, Frank Carr was ready to move into the next generation and the next generation. So all of you in the INROADS program now, going through the training, working in corporations, know that you are a part of a long generation of disruptors. Now, the way that I choose to disrupt might be different from yours. But when I think about what inclusion and equity means, a lot of the work that I do in my career at Northern Trust, we recently embarked on a refresh of our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And it included several aspects. The two key aspects that we looked at were what were the implications or what were some of the hypotheses that we drew relative to representation in our organization, and how could we impact and influence those outcomes. We worked with our corporate board of directors, this process led by our chief executive officer, to whom I report, to really think about what were the levers we could pull to change, what was the quantitative and qualitative approach. Later on in the summit, you'll be looking at data and ways to leverage data to help move the needle. But it goes beyond just data. During the qualitative work that we did within our organization, we learned about the lived experiences of people of color and women within the organization. And we were courageous enough to ask ourselves those questions. Why are there differences in representation among those key groups? And what are we going to do about it? One hypothesis that we had was that movement was a direct correlation to success within the organization. And we looked at data. We looked at over 4,000 positions within our firm over 4 years. Who was getting the most movement? What were the implications of that? And we found that most of those moves were going to people who were not people of color. So we knew that that was a lever that we could use to help advance representation. And it's not just representation. We looked at our systems and structures and processes. What is it that we needed to do internally? How do we change behaviors, the neurology of bias and what that meant for us? And finally, how would we hold our leaders accountable? So we came away with that with 3 outcomes of our strategy: accountability, training and development, and culture. Accountability, we've often heard it said, what gets measured gets done. We created dashboards for our executives. They understand clearly what the data about representation in their specific business units are and what levers they can pull to help effectuate the kind of change in representation. Training and development. We knew that if we were to scale certain programs, we would be able to engage more individuals, people of color, and women. And finally, culture. Someone said that culture eats strategy for lunch. So we knew that if we didn't change the minds and the behaviors of individuals who are making these decisions, we would not get the outcomes that we were looking for. Maya Angelou said, if you're going to live, leave a legacy. Make a mark on the world that can't be erased. That is what disruptors do. That is what INROADS is. That is what brings us 50 years later, 50 years after the civil rights movement, to a place where some of the challenges, issues, and conversations seem to be consistent with what we talked about 50 years ago. But I want you to be encouraged and to know that the work we are doing and will continue to do is not in vain. The way that we address systemic and structural racism, the way that we disrupt decisions, policies, and practices that preclude inclusion in any aspect of our lives and particularly in the areas in which we work and live, we are the disruptors. We are the ones who are going to be innovative in how we approach the challenges, that we will lay wide open the opportunities that exist for us to be those courageous leaders. Frank Carr definitely left a legacy 50 years ago. Protests are another form of disruption. Every person who's gone through the INROADS experience understands disruption. There was a disruption for me when I went through the process many years ago because I had to learn to see myself as someone who could be a part of corporate structure, experiences that were new to me at the time. But it is within that disruptive process of INROADS and leadership that I learned that I mattered, as I often heard from my Girl Scout troop leader, that I was not what was the matter, that I mattered. So because of that experience, I knew that I could do more, be more, expect more. We as a country and as a world are in a liminal season. We're stuck between an ending and a new beginning. I heard someone say, and I think it is so relevant now, that we must learn to honor the space between no longer and not yet. No longer and not yet. That space is the place where resilience, possibility, and opportunity are born. Our social responsibility of understanding that if innovation is to occur, we have to consider and challenge ourselves to think about what resilience looks like for individuals in underserved communities and areas. How do we bring resources to bear to address some of the societal issues that we face? How do we look at the systems and structures, both within our own organizations where we work, but also within society? How are we representing ourselves? Are we courageous enough as leaders to ask the question and question the answer? A USA Today analysis shows that while corporations and boardrooms have added African Americans and other people of color over the decades, the executive suites have not. Even as some companies have diverse boards, a common reality in America, more than 55 years after the civil rights movement, is that the representation still remains, leaves a lot to be desired. Of the 279 top executives listed at the 50 biggest companies in the S&P 100, 274 are white, Hispanic, or other ethnicity. 5 are Black. I think to date, probably 3 Black CEOs. Only 2% are Hispanic. Statistics from 2017 show that Hispanics make up 17% of the labor force. However, they occupy only 4.3% of executive positions in the US. So the structural changes that can reduce or eradicate systemic racism are altogether different from cultural changes, and yet both must happen simultaneously. They require the reallocation of basic resources to really move beyond and equalize and normalize this wealth gap, something that we have to address. The truth of all of this is necessary and must be faced. I often tell individuals as we are working through diversity, equity, and inclusion training that I'm very comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that is one of the basic tenets of doing this work. John F. Kennedy said, "The great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Belief in myths allows the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought." As we seek to abolish the myths about people of color, about our ability and our capacity, and all of us collectively to make change, to disrupt things that don't honor the very basic dignity and humanity of each of us, then we have to consider that we are also disruptors and myth busters. What myths exist that preclude the progress that 50 years later we're still having this discussion about inclusion and equity? The disruption, the innovation that is required. For the progress that we've made, yes, I acknowledge and celebrate that. For the work to be done, I implore and inveigle you to stay the course, to stay strong. And in closing, as we consider disruption and what we must continue to do to create sustainable change, to honor the higher and the best parts of ourselves, who we are as leaders, who we are as members of our community, that together we are stronger, that what INROADS taught me so many decades ago about my requirement, my responsibility to give back. Someone said that it is so important for us to remember and to understand that the good deeds I do for others is the rent I pay for occupying space on the earth. And I want to make sure that I'm not writing blank checks. And so when we think about disruption, this summit, and the work that will be done today, and all from whom you will hear, let us think about this sustainable change and the indefatigable pursuit of inclusion, justice, and equity. In closing, I want to leave you with this thought that Frederick Douglass said in 1875, and I think it speaks to us so very clearly today. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all absorbing, and for the time being, putting all other tumults to silence. It must do this, or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. I congratulate you and join you as we work hard to create the kind of disruptive innovation that will lead to a path of success, of expanding the opportunities for all, of the courageous leadership in honor of the memory of the outstanding, unparalleled work of Frank Carr, our founder, that INROADS, building that path to the future while having the bridge for what was connect for what is to be. As we honor the space between no longer and not yet, honor that space with disruption, with innovation, with courage, conviction, and commitment. Thank you all, and have a great summit.